thank you for coming to our regulations tracking and advocacy webinar. I am Karen Suhaka with BillTrack50. For once, I'll mostly be just watching and learning instead of talking, which I'm sure is a relief to those of you who come to lots of these, as I am a chatterbox. We've got Michael with us, who is our regulations expert, and he will be making the presentation. So Michael, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Good afternoon, Michael O'Brien. I'm the founder and principal of Mob Advocacy, a state and local government relations firm based in Washington, D.C. And I've been working with Karen and BillTrack50 since they were in beta. We both kind of started together and been helping with their legislative and regulatory clients for, what, 6 years now.
That's all true. True story.
So today we're going to be talking about regulatory advocacy. A lot of times I'm often asked, we track and advocate on the legislative side, but don't do a whole lot on the regulatory side. And people will ask me what they're missing. Well, regulations are kind of the meat on the legislative bones, where legislation, good legislation at its best, should be broad and forward-thinking, discussing how to deal with key issues. Regulations are more specific. They tell us how the state will implement and enforce legislation, provide rules and guidance on how to comply with legislative intent. And every state is different. So some states have strong legislatures where the legislators have more oversight over the regulatory process. In some states, the regulatory actions are overseen by the executive branch and the governor's office. So make sure your regulatory strategies are tailored to the specific state you are targeting.
And Michael, where would you say Congress falls on that spectrum?
So Congress, with our three co-equal branches of government, obviously you have the executive branch, which appoints agency leadership, but Congress has oversight over all of those agencies. So when you talk about agency spending, you have Congress calling in agency heads all the time and talking about programs and budgets and spending. And when it gets out of hand, you have oversight hearings, which I don't think any agency head wants to get called in on, but it does happen. So I would say our federal branch is very co-equal with obviously your executive branch naming leadership, providing direction, but with Congress providing a lot of oversight.
Okay, and then for some of the states, it can be a little bit different.
A lot of every state is different. That's the fun part of state advocacy and state lobbying. So people,
bills. So yeah, let's talk about the difference between bills and regs.
That's a perfect segue. So legislatures pass bills that become law and statutes, and regulatory agencies pass rules that become administrative code. While they're different in terms of where they're located and what book they're in, they both have that same force of law. So if you break a state law or a state statute or a state rule or a state code, they're both enforceable either by some judicial jurisdiction, whether that's the state police or some agency official. So they both have that same force of law.
So regulations are just as important as legislation.
Just as important. They're different in that the legislative cycle is fairly linear. You have bill introduction, committee hearing, pass House 1, committee hearing in House 2, pass House 2, signed signed by the governor, and there you have how a bill becomes a law. The regulatory cycle is far more sporadic, often without clear timing from start to finish, not always clear in terms of what's the next step. But they do follow a general outline of notification of proposed rule, hearing, and solicitation of comments, and then a final rule of draft and an approved rule with an effective date. But depending on the state, there could be, various right turns and left turns and U-turns thrown in there. Some
So
states,
how are you supposed to keep up with all of that?
that's, I think that's one of the reasons regulatory advocacy is a lot less practiced, is that it's a lot harder to keep up with.
I generally think of it as a nightmare.
It can be a nightmare. Fortunately, this is the tips and tricks. We're gonna show you a great tool, which I think is the best regulatory tracking tool out there.
All right, well, let's get to tips and tricks before we get too depressed.
So here we're going to go over 7 kind of tips and tricks. Start early, track, integrate compliance and advocacy teams, know your regulators, do not miss deadlines, know the importance of messaging, and getting involved in regulatory groups and associations. So if you do these 7 things, your regulatory advocacy can really take off.
All right, let's get into it. What do you mean by start early?
Start early. So I start regulatory advocacy during the legislative process.
Before the bill even passes?
Before the bill even passes. A lot of times regulatory changes are based on a bill coming out, where I said the bill is broad and forward thinking. Well, at some point a legislator or a regulator is going to have to implement that bill. And so talking to them is important, because based on their knowledge of the subject matter, they can give you some idea of how the bill is going to be enforced and implemented, and that might change your view of the bill. So I use regulatory advocacy as part of my legislative advocacy strategy. As I said, it's important to know how a bill is going to be enforced and implemented, to decide what the real impact is. And I'm also, by doing so, you can leverage regulators to help pass or defeat legislation.
Oh, interesting.
Legislators, pardon?
That's interesting.
Yes, legislators all the time will introduce bills without a clear impact on what the outcome of that bill is going to be, and so bringing in a regulator that can talk from an unbiased view, from the state's view, on what the impact is going to be and how that's going to impact kind of compliance and enforcement, not from my view but from the state's view, is a very powerful tool for a legislator to think about as they're voting.
Michael, I'm shocked that you would say a legislator might introduce something they don't fully understand.
Well, they do. Fortunately, regulators are often come through the profession. So your regulators often have a very strong idea and a clear knowledge of what the impact of legislation is. And they have far more understanding of the issue and the industry. So a legislator is really going to take what a regulator has to say seriously, sometimes far more seriously than a lobbyist, whether that's a contract lobbyist from the state or an in-house lobbyist coming in from DC or wherever your headquarters are located.
Well, that is a fantastic tip.
Number 2, track. As we said, tracking regulations are a nightmare. Every state does it differently, and I think there's 1 or 2 of them that do it well, and 48 that do them not so well. And as I said, I think BillTrack50 has built the best tracker out there. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Karen to do a little demo of BillTrack50.
Well, we've got track right in our name. That's all you need to know, right? All right, so am I successfully showing my screen? I've got Nebraska up.
I see it.
Great. So this is an example of a state that does a good job. So I just wanted to kind of give an example of what regulations look like in the wild, if you will. Hopefully you've seen some bills on different websites, legislature websites. Well, this is what regulations are going to look like. And this is Michael's favorite. He likes Nebraska the best because it lays it out in this grid. So this might be a great time for you to talk very quickly about the actual process that a regulation moves through, since we've got it on the screen.
Yep. So, I love the state because it tells you exactly what the next step is. It may not give you, what their time frame is, but you can see right on there, you've got the hearing notice, which is the date the proposed rule becomes public. That's the hearing notice. Then the scheduled hearing, which might be the same date that comments are due, but not always. So keep that in mind. But you have a scheduled hearing date, which is a good date that if no other date is out there, that's a date to have your comments in by, or make sure if it's really important, make sure you can attend those hearings. And then you can see the Attorney General's office received a notice. They give their decision, is this, does this comply with the state's constitution? The governor's policy office receives it. They make a decision, yay or nay. Then it gets filed at the Secretary of State's office with an effective date. And so, while it's pretty much final once it's received at the Secretary of State's office, it might not go into effect for, another 6 months. And I think lobbyists are used to that with legislative and effective dates.
Absolutely. All right, so then we've got the New Mexico example, which, not to say anything about New Mexico, this is just normal. This is what, except maybe a little prettier. So often they publish these registers, right, which is just a compendium of everything proposed and everything that's finalized and whatnot for a week or for 2 weeks or for a month. And so these are periodic publications that the Secretary of State publishes. Lots of states do it this way. Not all of them. Some of them don't have any central place where it's all gathered up, but a lot of them do have these registers. And at least this register is a nice place where you can go, even though it's harder to read. It doesn't have that grid. You can't tell where it is in the process. At least it's something, right, Michael?
That's correct. And it generally, if you go to one of the sections, you'll see all the pieces laid out. It'll tell you if it's, a primary notice, which will tell you, this is what the rule's about. It should have either the changes in it or a link to the changes, and it usually has the comments due deadline. If it's if it's a rule update, if it's an update of that, it might say, here's the changes post comment, or hey, after comments we didn't make any changes. And then usually at some point it'll post a third time and say, hey, this is the final rule with an effective date of X.
All right. So you guys got a little preview as I was logging into BillTrack50. So I just logged in and went to the regulation sheets and then opened up this one about corporate taxes. So if you are a customer of BillTrack50, you know that you just set up queries to get your bills. Same exact thing for regulations. You set up queries. You've got most of the same options, although you can search just a period of time so that you don't go too far back, because unlike legislation, there's not sessions where it's like current this year, because regulations have an unknown amount of time, just as Michael has pointed out.
I want to track the regulation for 3 years.
That's terrible. That's not helpful. All All right. So then once you've found your regulations, we will tell you, what state it is, of course, and then you can go and read it right on the page. So we just drop you into that, often the register that we just showed you, with your search terms highlighted. So it's not as good as the bills are, where we've got that nice graphic across the top and all that other information, but at least we'll show you what you need to read about corporate income or corporate taxes, and then we will let you know every time a regulation is proposed or finalized, and we'll send you alerts just like we do with bills. So that is the tracking part. But to Michael's point, you can also set up for yourself something more like Nebraska, which we have done here, and Michael and I have done quite a bit of this for people, where you can actually look through there and figure out for yourself when the comments are due and then put that in. So this is just a template that we've set up, but we like it. And so if you want this template, I'm happy to give it to you and put it into your account, so that you can give yourself a little screen where you can keep up with exactly what's going on. And so that'll be just, fill out when the comments are due and whatnot through this little form, and then you'll be up to date. Anything else you want to point out about setting up regulation tracking?
Yeah, so two little tricks here. When I track regulations, I often track with broader terms than my legislative tracking.
Good point.
And one, that's because you're going to pull in a lot less regulations, and so you have a little more time you can spend a little more time going through them. And two, you never know, you often don't know how a regulation is going to impact your industry, and so by going a little broader, you might see things that you wouldn't necessarily think would have impacted your industry, but do. Having worked in all kinds of regulated industries, from healthcare to environmental and pesticides and fertilizer to education, you just never know. And so tracking a little broader is important. And second, you see the little rule identifier that was in that table. If there's a regulation that you really think is important and want to keep up with it, I tell people to take that identifier and make a new search. And so while my broad search will pull in new regulations from on a number of different topics, I also have a search that will hit, hey, every time this regulation comes up, so makes it a whole lot easier to follow through the process.
I'm trying to find where that number is. It's a long reg that I picked.
It's usually at the very beginning.
I know. There we go.
At the very end.
Yeah. So here we go. I got up to it. So yeah, so you can search either for what's being changed, or if they give it an actual number, which, boy, I picked a bad example. Here we go. So here's the actual beginning of it. You can just set up a whole new search for this, and that way if they change it, if they finalize it, it'll pop back up for you. So that's another tip, is to pick, the specific number that they've assigned it, the file number or whatever, and search for that. And that works really well. All right. So that way you won't miss anything. So template, and then also you can search by just those specific codes to make sure that the regulations will come back for you. Excellent. Shall I give the screen back to you?
Sure. I can tell you, as somebody that tracked regs before this tool, and kind of had a hand in talking to the coders that developed this tool, this tool saves hours off of my work, and so it's been one of my greatest treats of working with Karen and her team. They built this kind of specifically for for what I asked them to do. And, I think it works even better than I had anticipated when I asked them to build it.
And you can't influence it if you don't know about it. But let's talk about how to influence it.
How to influence it. I talk about integrating when I teach legislative advocacy. I tell organizations to integrate, their state, their federal, and their sales teams because it's important. When I talk about regulatory advocacy, it's critical to integrate your compliance and advocacy teams. If you're in a regulated industry, you probably have some kind of compliance team, whether it's the team that gets your drugs or your chemicals approved by the state, whether it's you're getting your insurance or your healthcare organization approved by the state. There's probably some kind of compliance team that you have, and it's important to integrate those teams. One, often as the advocate, I'm talking to high level regulatory officials. That might be the agency head or the key staff heads. Your compliance people are talking to people who deal with your industry on a day-to-day basis. And so you might have different relationships, which gives you more areas to go in, angles, avenues, pieces to develop strategy. And so, by cutting out half of that, you're cutting off half of your ability to influence regulators. And second, it's important to stay on message. It's one of the worst things I think is for your compliance team to go in and say, hey, this regulation is going to mean this to our industry, and let's make these changes. And for you as an advocate to go in and say, hey, this regulation means, something different for our agency, and these are the pieces that we want changed. I mean, at worst, it makes you look unorganized, or at best, it makes you look unorganized. At worst, it kind of makes you look disingenuous and dishonest. And we know in a relationship building field, there's nothing worse for you than looking, disingenuous and dishonest. So,
especially since this is specifically rules-oriented people, right?
Especially for rules-oriented people, they're often, especially on the compliance side, they're often a lot more rigid than those on the policy and strategy side.
All right, so for two reasons you want to keep it integrated, so that you have every chance and so that you're making sure your story is straight.
Absolutely. And so as you're integrating, it's important to know your regulators. I tell people in your key states, you want to see your regulator once a year. And in non-key states, probably every other, at worst, every third year. And that could mean a lot of travel, but we'll give you a little tip for that later. I talked about tip number 7, and that's going to be an important tip. But, just as a lobbyist, I want to build relationships with legislators. It's just important for my organization for me to build relationships with regulators.
Okay, so for legislation, you've got different committees, and they're going to be important. And so for regulations, it's agencies.
Different agencies. It might be the insurance agency. It might be the agricultural agency or department. It might be the Department of Education. It could be the motor vehicle department. It depends on, there's probably a regulator for your industry, but not always. But there's usually some sort of regulator for your industry. I'm amazed at the.
I'm sorry, you're saying you want to meet with them face to face if you can every year in your key states for your key agencies.
In your key states, and most organizations have 5 or 6 key states. Okay. And then, probably 10 secondary states, and then 30 states that mean a lot less to them. as an industry, but you can rely on your associations to do that. But just if you're doing that, just remember, your association is on your side, until they're not. That's always the caveat of working with associations and coalitions.
All right.
Do not miss deadlines. I can't stress this enough. No matter how much groundwork you've done talking with your issues, even if you start early and have an idea of what it's going to look like and what issues are going to come up even before that regulation comes out, if your comments do not come in before the comment deadline, they very likely cannot and will not be considered. Agencies are run by lawyers, and they're run by lawyers who believe very, very, very strongly in deadlines. And just remember, it's especially important to get your comments in if your organization has issue with the rule change, because most agencies have to respond to each individual comment, and some states, those comments are published publicly in the registers. So if you've submitted comments and have issue with a rule change, you have to make that public, because often the next step, if a rule change goes through that your industry or organization isn't happy about, the next stage is often suing the state or suing the agency, and having that public piece that said, hey, this is our problem with this rule change is going to be critical for that lawsuit to go forward.
Okay, so when you become aware that a regulation has been proposed because BillTrack50 told you, or because your association or your trade group told you, then you want to figure out if the reg applies to you, and then the very next thing to do is find that comment deadline and mark it down on your calendar.
Absolutely.
All right, don't mess with the deadlines.
Don't mess with deadlines. And then I talked about knowing that messaging is important. In legislative advocacy and legislative lobbying, we often tell people to tell your story and make something, get your story across, whether that's through logic or impact, or your passion and how that directly impacts your life.
Right, flying days, bring in people who have a personal story and put it in front of the legislators.
Absolutely. Sorry, with regulatory advocacy, you're dealing with lawyers, and you're dealing with people who know the ins and outs of your industry. And so it's important to tone down the passion and talk about the true impact of those rule changes. For regulatory advocacy, your audience is a mix of lawyers and professionals. They understand your issue far better than a legislator ever will, and your language should reflect that. Regulatory comments should focus on specific points of the rule that you have issue with. If possible, cite other sources that support your stand. A well-directed, well-researched, well-cited comment letter will be far more powerful to that audience than your traditional legislative advocacy messaging. I'll cite an example. I was working with a healthcare organization that had an issue with the state's new directive for dry needling for physical therapists. And they were cutting down the educational requirement from, I think it was 6 months to 8 weeks. I don't remember that off the top of my head. But, one of my members called up and said, look, this isn't enough. And, they were able, they were passionate about it as a patient safety aspect, but we were also able to pull in some previous guidance from the state that noted that agencies' interest in supporting the original education level, some guidance from outside organizations that said the traditional education wasn't enough, and for this particular procedure they needed additional training. And pulling that together and submitting that letter on time, the state regulator called me up and said, "Hey, we got your member's message. You know, we understand that obviously this is something we want to take a look at," and they put my member on a panel to talk about, hey, what's the right way to change that. And if we talked solely from a patient safety position, you could see that in every other letter that came through the online system, but talked about specifics in education and citing the state's guidance and other organizations' guidance. It showed a level of understanding of the issue that that made our members stand out and got our message across.
Great example. So less hyperbole, no pictures of horrible dry needling accidents, but rather facts and figures and credible presentation.
Absolutely.
Good tip. I think that's our key tip.
Last but not least, regulatory groups and associations, and a lot of legislative advocates can understand this because we go to organizations like the National Governors Association, the Council of State Governments, or the National Conference for State Legislatures to meet and build relationships with those policymakers, because we know it's far easier to travel to one conference and meet with 30 states worth of people than it is to travel to 30 different states. Well, regulatory agencies work the same way.
Thank goodness. I wasn't sure how I was supposed to meet all my regulators.
I've been to meetings of state regulators, from the attorneys general to the Association of State Departments of Agriculture to the state Medicaid directors, down to the National Association of Plant Food Control Officials and the National Association of STD Directors. So it runs from the very top to the very bottom. And it's important to get involved with these groups. One is a relationship building tool, and that is important. But two, you're talking about groups of regulators that are talking about trends in your industry. Talking about, this is what I see coming down the pipe, and this is how we're regulating it. Well, how that one state is regulating it might then end up in 20 states or 30 states or 40 states. And if you're not there talking about it at that meeting, you might be fighting something in 20 states or 30 states and 40 states. And, I know that no advocate wants to do that.
So this is part of the start early strategy as well.
It is part of the start early strategy. But when something balloons, it's hard to control, and so controlling it at that very beginning stage is important. And a last issue with groups and associations, often they'll publish kind of standard codes that states will use for their compliance and their enforcement. And you, as an advocate, as industry, want to have influence on those codes and make sure they are things that your industry can stand behind and can comply with. Otherwise, you're going to get dinged. Again, you're going to get dinged in 20 states or 30 states or 40 states, depending on how many states recognize those pieces of code. I worked on fertilizer issues with nitrogen levels in states, and I will tell you, if we did not get in early and deal with nitrogen levels with that agency, it would have ballooned out of control. It happened at the same time it was starting to balloon out of control on the legislative side, and so we were working two-tiered advocacy solutions at the time. But working with those regulators was critical in stemming a lot of bad legislation down the road.
All right. So that kind of brings together all the lessons.
And that does bring together all the lessons. So, just to recap, make sure you start early. I can't stress that enough. Know your deadlines, know your messaging, know your regulators, get involved, and it makes your advocacy strategies that much easier down the road.
All right. Well, thank you, Michael. I think there were some great nuggets in there. And does anybody have any questions? Would anybody like us to go back over a point? Would anyone like to tell a story? Consider the floor open. There's the little chat box that you can use in your dashboard there, and there's also the questions. You can raise your hand, and if you'd like, you can ask me to unmute you. So we are open for questions, or even if you're looking for a little bit of advice on an angle with Michael, I'm happy to entertain that as well. And then, Michael, do you have one more story you want to tell real quick while we're waiting for people to type in their messages? Didn't see that coming, did you?
No, you're supposed to warn me.
Well, this I find to be very helpful, so sorry to put you on the spot like that.
I will tell you, if you lack the resources to get involved with a number of different organizations, if you were to focus in one place, I would focus efforts on the Council of State Governments, because they bring all of those tiers together. They might not necessarily focus on your issue, although if you talk to them, they can usually work it in somehow. But they deal with the legislative, executive, and kind of agency side and judicial side all together, and so it gives you kind of a holistic approach to advocacy on both the legislative and advocacy, or legislative and regulatory side. So if you're lacking the resources to get involved in 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 organizations, I would focus some time and effort there.
All right, and so those conferences would also be a good place to go and meet the people that you need FaceTime with.
Yes.
All right, well, it does not look like we have any questions. So thank you, everybody, for attending. Hopefully you found something useful in here. We will be sending you this video tomorrow, I think, and along with a few links that we hope you will find helpful. By all means, you've got our contact information on the screen. You can reach out to Michael for any advice, or you can reach out to me anytime, and we're both happy to help you. So thanks very much, and thank you, Michael.
Yeah, and definitely, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and we'll set up a time to talk.
All right. Good luck, everybody. I hope it all goes well for you out there. Bye-bye.
Thank you.